Okay, welcome everyone. And today I'm going to talk to you about automatic grammar agreement in message formatting. It's a very exciting topic in my mind. My name is George Roten, and I work at Apple, and I specifically work primarily on Siri, on the software nationalization side of Siri. And I also work on parts of the foundation framework dealing with message formatting and creating grammatically correct responses. So the agenda today, we're just going to introduce to you what this is all about, provide some examples that the industry is having a difficult time providing a grammatically correct response, some examples of the syntax. I'll also introduce to you the concept of inflection. You may think that you know your own language, but once you go beyond your own language, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And I'll conclude with summarizing what this is all about. So what is this topic? What we're trying to do is we're trying to generate a message on a computer, and the message needs to be grammatically correct, as if a human wrote it. And the message needs to be translated into other languages, not just English. You're not just concatenating strings together. And the word choice in the message needs to agree with the identity of the human. This is an important topic, and I'll go into more details about that later. And as part of this talk, I'm going to assume that you remember some basics about English from your English class. You know what a noun, an adjective, a verb, adverb, and a pronoun are, and you can count things. I really hope you can do that. The message and the type of message that we're trying to format is, it should be pretty clear. It's not something like you'd see in a large language model. It's pretty clear, like you have the tense of the verb, future, past, or present. You have one missed phone call today. You have 2 new messages. You have 3 meetings tomorrow. The word choice is pretty. It's pretty consistent in the messages. And the message that you're trying to display can contain user vocabulary, and this is an important detail. So you don't necessarily know the word that's going to be put into your message when you're translating. You won't know until you actually format it on the user's computer. And we're dealing with just a finite set of context-sensitive words. So you're not dealing necessarily with named entities like a town in the middle of nowhere necessarily, but you're dealing with a lot of just common phrases, like the word of messages or meetings. So to start off, let me give some examples. So we have the word agreement. What could come in front of this word? And what we have here is a scenario where we could put the definite article in front of it. In English, it's pretty easy. You put the word the in front of it, and there's really no other choice. And so I can put any word after the, and it's still going to be the same thing. But in a lot of scenarios, you can also use other ones, like the indefinite article, an or a. I have a choice here, and which one is grammatically correct? So it is actually, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to put in, for the word agreement, you're supposed to use the word an. The reason why is because it's in front of the vowel. You would use a if the next word started with a consonant, like the word table. You'd say a table, but not an table. And you go, okay, great. I can just look at the beginning of the word, the first letter, and say, is it A, E, I, O, or U? And that determines if it's a vowel or not. The answer is no. It's not how it's written, it's how it's pronounced. For example, I could have an umbrella, or a unicorn, or an LED light, and you notice that there's some ambiguity here, and I'm not, those are scenarios where it's not clear based on how it's written, and you have to have a property associated with the word to know if it starts with a vowel or a consonant. Now, if we get into a scenario of putting a number in front of a word, I could say one agreement. That is all grammatically correct. But I could also have a scenario where I want to put the number 2 in front of it. Now in this scenario, since I put the number 2 in front of it, I now need to change the second scenario and turn into 2 agreements. I need to change it from singular to plural. This notion of singular and plural is a grammatical category. And during this talk, you may see me refer to that as a grammeme. It's a grammatical category value. Now in this scenario, you go, hey, all I have to do is add an S if it's a plural. I've seen this happen in a lot of people translating their UIs. They're like, oh, add an S if it's 2 or not 1. That's not quite correct. If I want to say yen, there's 1 yen and 2 yen. It does not inflect. I do not add an S. There is no such thing as 2 yens. And go, okay, well, maybe I'll change it from, in some scenarios I won't add an S, and sometimes I do, but that's not always the case. I can also get into a scenario where I actually morphologically change the whole word, or it's just a completely different word for the plural form. So I could have 1 goose, 2 geese. And that's a scenario that's very important to note. It's not a trivial thing to do, even in English. You can also have scenarios in French. Let's move on to French. And before, I provided examples of, well, what if I wanted to put a definite article in front of it? And as some of you may know, in French, there's more than 1 definite article that I can put in front of it. I'm not going to try to pronounce these words, but I'm just going to at least point out that the first one is singular masculine, starting with a vowel. It's a contraction. The second one is the plural of the word, the definite word. There's the feminine form, and then the masculine form when it starts with a consonant. And so these are 4 definite articles that could be put in front of those words. And then for a language like French, you don't have the same number for the indefinite article. In that scenario, you have 3. And they also have depend on the grammatical properties of the word that you're referring to, if it's singular, masculine, or feminine, or plural. And if I want to quantify things, I also have a scenario. I also need to change it from singular to plural, depending on whether or not the number is, well, if you know about the CLDR plural rules, you'll know that it's not necessarily if it's equal to 1, it's around 1. It's slightly different. If you've read the CLDR plural rules, that's an important distinction. You won't notice that until you get into like 1.1 kilometers. But I'm just pointing out that CLDR plural rules are important for this scenario. So we've gotten into some basics here. And for these basics, we've just handled 2 words. So what if we want to handle more than a couple words? Let's do an entire phrase or a sentence. So here's a pretty simple one. In this scenario, we have the light is on. Okay, pretty easy, no problem. But let's say I want to change this thing that I'm inserting to the message. It could be user vocabulary. It could be something else that you may not necessarily know until runtime and not translation time. So, if I change this word light to lights, in this scenario, when I format this, it becomes the lights is on. It doesn't sound grammatically correct. And what's happening here is that we want to change the word is to are. And go, okay, well, we got a scenario. Just look at maybe at the suffix, see if it ends in an S, and I'm good to go. But what about the light on the front porch is on? Well, that's correct. But what if I change it to the lights on the front porch? In that scenario, you want to change it to are. And the thing that you're changing, that you're detecting, is the word before the preposition, in this case, on. And you're just checking if it's singular or plural. I could even have the red lights on the front porch are on. It's still that word. And we're not dealing with something that requires a large language model necessarily to detect this kind of information. You're just parsing a very simple part, and you're just changing the word is or are. So we have that English example now. Now we're going to go back to French and try to look at the light is on. I'm not going to try to pronounce this French phrase because I know that my French pronunciation is pretty bad. It's atrocious. But the point here is that the light is on in French. Similar situation, you might think that, okay, all I need to do is change the equivalent of is, and I'm good to go. In that scenario, it's grammatical number, just like English, but French is a little bit more difficult. We have all these dependencies. So the grammatical number of what word I'm inserting into the phrase affects all the other words. Grammatical gender, if it's masculine or feminine, changes the definite article and even the word on. And even the definite article also depends on whether or not the word starts the vowel. And to give some examples, there are 5 possible ways to write the same thing depending on what thing I am turning on. So the first one is like the light is on, second one is the lights are on, and the third one is the device is on, the fourth one is the fan is on, and the last one is the fans are on. And you can see that the spelling changes quite a lot. So enumerating all the possible values for every language that you support is really difficult, and it's not really, well, I mean, it's viable, but it's not convenient and it's difficult. And we want to make that a little bit simpler. And before I go on, I want to cover a related topic. So I mentioned grammatical number, grammatical gender, whether or not the word starts with the vowel or not. There's also a notion of grammatical case. And this is something that a lot of people have a kind of a difficult time understanding what grammatical case, especially if your language is primarily English. So any preposition that you can refer to in a given language that's equivalent to like in or on or to or from, a lot of these prepositions could actually become a suffix on a given word. This happens more frequently on Eastern European languages. In a language like German, there's 4 grammatical cases. In English, you'd say there's just 2, really. And one of the important ones is the nominative case. It's the word that you see in isolation. It's typically the word that you look up in your dictionary. And an example of a nominative form would be like bunny or bunnies. So that's the nominative form in English, both singular and plural. But if I want to make something possessive or the genitive form, I would actually say bunnies apostrophe s if it's singular. And if it's plural, I'd add an apostrophe after the s. Other languages may or may not list the other derivations of a word because a native speaker just knows how to derive them. And that may be difficult for some people. And it is a separate state from other states like definiteness, whether it's a grammatical gender or grammatical number. So we deal with some of the complexities here. And so how do we solve some of these complexities? So what we have is we want something that is designed to support grammatically correct responses. We want localizers to use a markdown flavor to annotate strings. This reduces the overhead and burden of trying to figure out how to translate this stuff. Little to no code changes required, so we don't want to have a large burden of adopting the syntax. And we are trying to, in our framework, in Apple's foundation framework, we are trying to minimize the usage of if and switch kind of constructs. And to show what this looks like, let's show an example. So Markdown, if you're familiar with like how Wikipedia Markdown syntax or even some other systems, in this example, I can have a word and it's surrounded by square brackets. And then afterward in parentheses, I could have a link to some sort of file. And that would turn into a hyperlink, for example. I could also insert an image by typing an exclamation mark in front of the square brackets. And that becomes the alternative text in the square brackets. And the image address is included in the parentheses. The markdown syntax also allows extended attributes. In Apple's flavor of markdown, it supports a similar syntax for arbitrary attributes or extended attributes. And a caret is used before the square brackets and followed by the attributes in parentheses. The attributes do not affect how the text is rendered, but can be interpreted at developers' discretion. And in the scenario, in the parentheses, we're using JSON key value pairs. So in that example, we have this. We want to get something a little bit more complicated. We want to inflect a quantity. So we have some sort of number and a noun, and then we put in inflect is true. So we've reserved a few key attributes for annotating parts of the string that need automatic grammar agreement. Here the noun photo has changed to photos if the numeric argument is not one in English. The CLDR plural rules are used to determine when to use the singular or plural form. Notice that there are no conditionals to choose the correct form of the word. It's inflecting the word using a lexical dictionary. And I will probably, I'll try to cover what the lexical dictionary might look like in some languages later on as an example. So with that example, what would this message look like? So if I provided the number 0, I'd get 0 photos selected. If it's 1, it'd be 1 photo selected. Notice that the photo changes to singular form, while the other all other numbers change it to plural. And let's say I don't necessarily know what I'm, maybe I'm not dealing with photos, maybe I'm counting some quantity, a unit, a measurement, and this starts touching into the CLDR measurement units. And what you have is you just have some sort of pattern, and you just need to know what the unit is, and then you can just define whether it's singular or plural as necessary. So I could have it as 2 arguments. It's the number 0 and the word message, and I get 0 messages. If it's the number 1, the word bike, I get 1 bike. If it's the number 4, I get the word person, and then I turn into 4 people. Notice that I'm not just adding an S at the end, I'm actually choosing the plural form in this scenario. Sometimes you need to disambiguate what the word is. So for those ambiguous scenarios, you can also use this syntax. And the grammatical engine needs to know what to do in this scenario, because there's work as in a noun and work as in a verb. So in this scenario, we have work, and we're just annotating just the word work, that it is a noun, and that we're still requesting it to inflect equals true. And this scenario, we have maybe like 0 works of art, or 1 work of art, or 4 works of art. That's an example where it's a noun. But I could also have a scenario where, no, I really meant the other one. I mean verb. So I could have a scenario where I want 0 work, or 1 works, or 4 work. I'm talking about like the number of devices that are working. And that's an important scenario where I need to disambiguate between which form I really want. If I don't really want to depend on the number, I can also just explicitly request a specific form if it's singular or plural. But in this case, we're using number as a stand-in for the CLDR plural rules. And we can express any grammatical number, gender, part of speech, and the attribute values. And for best results, only mark the inflect segment with the what needs to be inflected. Marking the whole sentence can have unintended consequences. You can inflect the wrong words. But if you're just requesting a very specific word to make plural or depend on whatever you're trying to modify, just mark that segment for inflection. In this scenario, I can ask if the argument is like pets, get it. Does this photo contain any pets? Same with person. Does this photo contain any people? Bicycle. Does this photo contain any bicycles? So that message can provide 3 of those results. And I can use pretty much any user vocabulary is necessary. And here's a scenario where we're dealing with grammatical gender, but there's also a little bit of confusion about grammatical gender and physical gender. But in this scenario, we're just talking about a person's pronouns. And this is an important bit of functionality. In iOS, for example, in your contacts, you can specify a user's pronouns, not only for yourself, but of other people. And if the user's pronouns for the contact that you provide is he, him, his, this message format will turn into, you have sent money to him. Or the other possibilities are, you have sent money to her, you have sent money to them. Computers are really bad in knowing whether or not what you're referring to is masculine, feminine, or neuter. And this is an example where large language models really fail because they are trained on bias. You know, it will learn, oh, well, I'll provide some sort of response, and, well, you always send money to your brother, so it's always him. Well, as soon as you need to send it to someone else, maybe your mom or your sister, now that bias is not being taken into account. You really need to provide a very explicit, need to respect the explicit way to address someone. In this message format, we also have this notion of referent concept, and that's what you provide. You provide the address information, or the contact information, and from that you'll get the pronoun as necessary from that. Beyond English, you also have this Spanish example. So it's important to note that there's a way to address a person in the first person, second person, and third person. In the previous example, I did it in the third person, you know, him, her, them. But I also have a scenario where I'm dealing with the person in the second person form, and I'm addressing them. And in Spanish, I could say bienvenido. You might say that generically, but if the person is feminine, you would actually prefer to say bienvenida. Or if you have no understanding about what the gender of the person is, or they choose not to provide it, or they don't want to be identified, they don't want to identify as masculine or feminine, you could say bienvenidos todos, which is welcome all. It's not as personal, but it is still grammatically correct. And in this scenario, you also see the inflection alternative, bienvenidos todos. So if it doesn't fall into that masculine, feminine form that's normally seen in Spanish, you can provide the alternative as necessary. And actually going back to this, it's important to note that in English, there's 4 grammatical genders: masculine, feminine, neuter, which is like it, which is also an inanimate form, and also they, them, theirs. And that tends to be more of a scenario of you don't know what the gender is, or they choose not to identify the gender. And that's, some people call that the epicene form, or it could be the common form in some other languages. Going back to this, so going on, if I want to inflect a definite article in Spanish, in this scenario, I just put the definite article L. There are 4 definite articles I can choose from: masculine singular, feminine singular, masculine plural, feminine plural. In this example, if I just give the argument gato, which is the word cat in Spanish, I could get el gato. But if I provide gata, it'll be la gata. And if it's the plural form gatos, it'd be los gatos. Technically, I could also have las gatas as necessary. Though I do recognize that a lot of Spanish speakers do not use the feminine form, but it is grammatically correct to do it this way. Speaking of cats, who doesn't love cats? We all love cats. So before I was talking about like the nominative form and genitive form in English, you also have the singular and plural. So we have cat and cats, and cats with an apostrophe S, and cats with an apostrophe. So this is pretty easy to work with. There's 4 ways, and then automatic grammar agreement and foundation. That framework doesn't support Swedish at this time, but it is shared functionality with Siri, and in Siri we do support Swedish. And I want to provide this more complicated, but not too complicated that overwhelms you, inflection table. So, so what we have here are 3 grammatical category values. We have nominative and genitive, singular and plural, and then for each of the singular and plural forms, we have indefinite and definite. And this starts to show where this shines. So we notice that we're not just putting the word in front, the article in front of the word. The definiteness becomes a suffix as a part of the word. And what I may want to do is not specify every single grammatical category. That can be very tedious. But what I could do is provide just a given word. Let's say I start with cat, and I just want to make it definite. It'll be katten. If I want to make it turn cat into the plural definite, it'd be katterna. And please excuse me if my pronunciation is bad for Swedish. It probably is. But I could also start from any other spot. I could say that I have katter, and then I want to make it genitive, it'd be katters. So I can move anywhere, I can start any point in this space, and then just modify one or more of these grammatical category values, grat means, and get what I desire. So there's a bit of inertia. You start with one place, and you just modify what you need to modify for the context of your sentence. So we have, some people may be asking what languages are supported. So we have English, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. You can use this in Apple's operating systems. And I also recognize that some people may be thinking, wait a second, I was looking for other kinds of message formatting. Well, here are some other examples. Of course, there's ICU's message format. There's Fluent, we're FBT, GNU Get Text. You gave a larger list, but there is a large number of them out there. There's also the Unicode message format working group that participated in it for a while. And I want to also mention that the reason why we have this kind of syntax is that we want to reuse the reuse of Markdown and JSON syntax lowers the learning curve. So you don't have to learn a brand new syntax. It reduces the complexity of repeating the words in slightly different contexts. You don't have to repeat the same thing over and over for each condition. It fits well into existing localization processes of apps, which reduces the translation effort and improves the quality. So the translators get the functionality they need. They can create grammatically correct responses while not requiring software developers to hard code a lot of grammatical context information into their software. It can just be part of the message format, and they can inflect their messages as appropriate. It reduces the constraints imposed by software developers to make grammatically correct responses. And it also works on memory constrained devices. So in this day and age of large language models, there may be a scenario of like, well, I need to create some sort of arbitrary message. And sometimes you don't need something that complicated, but you need something a little bit more functional than concatenating 2 strings together. So this provides a lot of an important framework to make it easy to make grammatically correct responses. And if you want to know more details about how this stuff works, we have the Foundation Data Formatting API reference here. There's also a couple sample code projects, and there is also a WWDC 23 presentation that goes into like how to adapt that to your app. And as a reminder, I work for Apple, so this is in the context of Apple products. And on a more personal note, when it came to all of those, to that inflection table, a lot of that is based off of a structured lexicon. So, knowing that this word is related to this other set of words and how I get from one state to another, and that's an important source of data. And I know that this has been an interesting topic in the past because CLDR provides measurement units and provides a whole bunch of units, but instead of inflecting the pattern, it'd be better to have the lexicon, and then you could just modify, you can just, in CLDR, you would be better served by just localizing just the pattern, and then having structured lexicon deal with all the ways to inflect that pattern, or a given word. So knowing if the word is how to go from singular to plural, that would be better suited in the structured lexicon. And if anyone wants to talk about such topics, I'm available after this talk to talk about such things. And with that, I'll leave it open to questions. I don't know if there's like a way to, let's see, turn this on. There we go.
Man, I love learning about all the grammatical nuances in every language. But something that holds us back is that at Meta we have dozens of programming languages that we're working with.
Yep.
And so we have to implement grammatical agreement in every single one, and it extends the complexity of our code. And we don't have a proven return of investment. And so that holds us back from actually doing this. And so something that I'm kind of so I wonder if you thought about this and kind of where we can go from here is, instead of like, I don't believe that engineers can actually write that syntax. I will, like, some engineers are going to be INT and champions are going to make sure that we're giving the right values, but there are additional things that, like honorifics, that like we need to, like, is this name a person or is it a business? And that matters in Japanese, but it doesn't matter in English. And so when we really dive into it to localize everything, there is too much complexity for us to expect product teams to actually do. And so I wonder if we can actually use the large language models and transform the English that people write as the source string into that syntax instead.
I mean, that's a possibility of using a large language model to create such syntax, to convert a message. I mean, I've seen examples of such things being able to create, to write software. So in this case, you could do something like that. Though I think like when it comes to honorifics, there still has to be some sort of concept stored somewhere that a given business is a business and not necessarily a person. There can be ambiguity sometimes.
Yeah. One thing is that you showed the list of languages that you implemented it, and it's pretty much Western Europe. So there's
a reason why I said that the framework is shared with Siri. So actually, the full Siri list of languages are supported, but there's a slight difference between what Siri can do and what the foundation framework can do. So in Siri, you're expected to start with a lemma, like singular nominative form, and then inflect appropriate. But in the foundation model, you're actually expected to start anywhere in that inflection table and then inflect to every other possible value. Oh. And that requires a little bit more effort dealing with, because also
I just wanted to point out that just covering Western European languages doesn't really make sure that your model will be able to carry on for.
So what I'm trying to say is that it does. We know that it works because it works in Siri, but there's a bit of.
No, but I mean, will it work for Hungarian? Will it work for some African languages?
It works. It works for Finnish.
Okay, that's.
I mean, if you can get it to work for Finnish, it can work for other stuff.
Another question is, I didn't understand. You can tell this word gets inflected or this word, but how does it know kind of which? There's this other word that says, well, does this need to be singular or plural? How do you
Also, that dependencies.
create this connection?
So
If you have it just before, you just, I mean, you had that person LLD or so, but if it's farther away,
so in this example, we have referent concept 1. So that's actually something provided by the programmer to refer to like what you're referring to. And you can actually add more than one of these as necessary. And you can just, what you're trying to do is depend on something that you're inserting into the message. So this is a way to kind of, you could actually have referent concept 2. You can provide multiple references.
and then how does it know what this referent concept 1 is?
So that's provided by the programmer.
The
software developers.
There's some additional stuff that's going on.
So within the code for a given language, the grammatical rules are language dependent. And so knowing that, oh, here's a noun, and for this noun, I'm going to, like, let's say, refer to a concept. Let's say instead of them, it's actor or actress. So what I can do is have referent concept refer. The programmer has provided the contact or something else that provides the pronouns or the grammatical gender, and then I'll modify actor or actress to be masculine or feminine as necessary.
Okay, so there's some other stuff around this that provides that information.
So as far as like getting into grammatical agreement, there is some code in the framework and foundation to do this.
Yeah, but I'm more interested in knowing how would I actually use it? I cannot just provide that string, but I also have to provide some additional.
It's like any message formatter. You have to pass the data in that
Yeah.
you're using. You could write this. You could write this message to say you have sent money to username.
Yeah.
And you're passing a user object, but you don't want to always say you have sent. You have sent money to Joe. Joe is now, every message has something that. So this is a pronoun agreement based on some piece of data in the Joe record or the person record.
Yeah, in that Joe record, there'd be some sort of gender or pronoun information.
And that's your referent.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. So that's the important context to provide. I think this is going to be our last question.
Yeah. So you mentioned contacts and using that for the grammatical agreements on contacts. So those are names. Do you have any support for name inflection? And that's hard. And across languages. That doesn't work with lexicons because you do have to do cross-language name inflection also.
Proper nouns more generally.
There's what's possible and what's exposed. So you may have noticed in this talk, I mentioned about how we were talking about a structured lexicon, so everything in the dictionary. Siri has a little bit more flexibility, and we can actually provide all the possible inflections. If I have a very special case, like let's say I want to talk about Munich's weather in German, for example. But let's say Munich, instead of Munich, it's some sort of small town near Munich, and it also has grammatical various forms to refer to. You could provide those forms as necessary, and you can customize it as necessary. We do not provide that in Foundation. Also, Siri will try to make a good guess. There's some heuristics behind that, and you don't necessarily need to throw like a huge large language model at this. Sometimes it's heuristics, like how to make a word singular or plural is actually pretty regular in English, for example. And there's just like a handful of if statements about that long on your computer screen that would handle like 99% of the words, and that 1% that's like doesn't follow those rules, you just use the structured lexicon for those scenarios. But yes, as far as named entities like that, that is not supported by this framework at this time. Though the functionality is lurking underneath there.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Let's give him a hand.